Let's play with our crumbs and scraps to create a 4-inch by 8-inch finished quilt block by forming a 4 at a time flying geese. For this block, you will need crumbs, scraps, strip sets, and any leftover pieces that you have. You can even chop down larger pieces. Just throw everything into a pile. You will also need background fabric, which I highly recommend something high contrast or a solid, or even a print that reads as a solid. Basically, nothing too busy since we want our scraps to outshine everything else. To make our 4 2-inch by 4-inch finished flying geese, you will need 4 3-inch squares for your background fabric. Now let's begin. First, you will take scraps of fabric and start sewing them together, plain and simple with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I have some rectangle scraps, so I'll just sew one next to the other. It doesn't matter on the length as we will be trimming things off as we go. I'm going to keep adding onto it, and since I added a piece that had a salvage edge, I'm going to cut it off. Our goal is to create a 5 1/4-inch square, and here I'm taking my ruler as since I added a larger scrap piece, I believe I'm already there, and yes, I am. It is always better to make your block slightly larger than needed. Next, I could add this larger piece of fabric and be done, as it will hit my 5 1/4-inch square goal, but that's no fun. So what I'm going to do is slice what I have already in half, and this half doesn't need to be a perfect half, more like an eyeball half, or you can even cut it in like an inch on one side and 2 inches on the other side. There really are no rules here to creating your scrappy block, but I'm just going to cut it. And all I'm going to do is once again keep continuing adding on. You can add vertical pieces to give it a different look and then trim off excess and maybe even cut it in half again. The only thing I recommend is to try and at least have a 1-inch piece of fabric. Anything smaller is fine, but it will make things more difficult with your seam allowances. Speaking of seam allowances, I highly recommend pressing your seams open, especially with these smaller quilt blocks. Now, I'm a rebel and I don't because I always burn my fingers with the steam iron, but it does make things a lot more challenging. If you have been creating more scrappy quilt blocks, you can also use the leftover pieces that you might have trimmed off and of course add it to this unit. What's great is nothing goes to waste here unless you are squaring your blocks up. Now, normally I don't like to add salvages to my quilt blocks. However, the scraps I am using are from a collection called Capri by Caterina Roxella, and her signature here on the selvage edge is gorgeous in my opinion. And upon measuring it, there actually is a 1/4-inch seam allowance available all around her name. A fun idea is you could cut out salvages and add it to your block. Now this would be neat as since this is her collection, having her name appear or even the collection's name somewhere in there when you piece it, I think it would look pretty neat. And I might do this later on. I won't with this quilt block as I'm afraid I might slice it and end up cutting it off with the future steps that are here to come. But now that everything is large enough, I'm going to cut out our 5 1/4-inch square. Next, you will take your background 3-inch squares and on the wrong side, you will draw a 45-degree line from corner to corner with a fabric marking tool. You'll place one of them on the bottom right corner and the other on the top left corner, right sides together. These two squares will overlap in the middle and this is correct. Now you will sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides of that line you drew, and since this is a little bit of a larger piece, you can pin each side to help hold everything together while you sew. Next, take a rotary cutter and cut on that line. I highly recommend a rotary cutter instead of scissors because of the seam allowances. It can be difficult to cut with scissors if you have many seams going on, so take your time when cutting. With our weird heart-shaped pieces, you will take another 3-inch square and place it on the lower point, having the line that you drew going the opposite direction. Once again, sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides of that line you drew, and cut on that line you drew, and you will be left with a flying geese unit. However, there is one last thing that we need to do, and that is square up our blocks. With this pattern, I am forcing you because we are working with scraps. We need to trim it 2.5 inch vertically. Doing so, the point of your flying geese needs to be a 1/4 inch away. That way, when you sew your flying geese together, that point will line up perfectly to your other pieces. The width should already be 4.25 inch wide, and all you'll need to do is trim off the dog ears if you prefer. Now you have made a total of 4 flying geese quilt blocks all at once, and with your geese, have fun and play with them. You can create multiple different patterns, add them to existing quilt blocks. You can even do row quilts, or even a border would look nice. And I do hope you have enjoyed this fun twist. If you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.